Hey everyone, George here, and welcome back to the Art of Water. Today's topic is basically regarding algae eater type catfish. We have the Otocinclids, and of course, we have others out there that are very good at doing pretty much the same thing. But I find that the Siamese algae eater seems to do the better job. Now, the reason I say that is because the Siamese algae eater will not only eat the brown algae that is very common on a new build or one that is about 3 or 4 weeks into your cycling, you start to develop this brown algae that if your tank's not planted, I would say heavily enough, you're more susceptible to that kind of thing. But it does happen, and pretty much every tank goes through that phase. The intensity of how much of that you get really depends a great deal, again, on the amount of plants that you put into a tank, because as we all know, the more you plant, the more competition algae has for the elements required to get it going. So therefore, if you plant heavily, your tanks will be less susceptible to the kinds of algae that are just very unattractive, or uh, I would say that many people get out of the hobby just because of algae in itself. It's probably one of the biggest factors for people leaving the hobby and just not really finding it fun to deal with. Now, how you can deal with this issue best, of course, is to have all the proper things in place. The first thing that I would say is, of course, like I said in the first part of the video, is plant as many plants as you can possibly afford and put in there. Again, that is going to be your biggest competition for algae, and most people that do this and have all their water parameters, their lighting, and everything in place really see a minimal amount of algae issues throughout the life of their tank if they're very good at doing all the things that are necessary. Now, the first thing, as I talked about, is if you put some fish in there that are going to be good, cleanup crews for that kind of thing. The best thing that I can tell you is to get some Otocinclus. They're great little fish for the brown algae, and if you think that that's the only algae issues you're going to have, you're probably going to be wrong. There are so many different variations of algae in there. There's probably more than I could ever have time to talk about. But seeing that we are talking about the specific topic of algae and algae solutions, things that we can do to minimize the amount of algae in a tank, then I would secondly tell you that the next best fish that I believe that can take care of this problem, along with some snails, if you get some nitrite snails, they really can be a huge solution to that problem. They'll pretty much eat any kind of algae that they come across. They're slow movers, so they're not real fast at it, but they're, I think, a good secondary plan for your tank to make sure that you're getting everything and putting algae sort of dead in its tracks. Now, the Siamese algae eater I find to be the better of the two for larger tanks and for tanks that you have enough room to put a few of those in there. Now, both fish require not just one fish, but a minimum of two. They do like schools, Otocinclids. I typically will try to put 3 to 5 in a tank that's 20 gallons or less, and of course on a 5 gallon or a 3.7 gallon that's a nano tank, that's going to be kind of hard to do. But you want to put at least a minimum of 2 in a tank that size. Siamese algae eaters, a little bit more active fish and a lot more efficient at cleaning up every kind of algae that you can think of in your tank. They're just really good cleanup crew, and they do a great job. Now, one of the problems that I find with the Siamese algae eater is they're very skittish. So if you do have a tank that has just been planted, it is uh, fairly new. Uh, for the first 3 or 4 days that Siamese algae eaters, Otocinclus can do the same thing. They're just not as big and they're not as destructive, but you will find that the Siamese algae eaters, if they're a little bit skittish when the lights come on and that kind of thing, they will just absolutely rip through your tank at just warp speed and absolutely create havoc and tear up all your carpet plants pretty much. I'm not talking about your deep-rooted plants. I'm talking about your carpet plants that sort of sit on the surface and aren't really fully rooted uh, and have very, very shallow roots and not much to anchor them down. So those fish, Otocinclus can do the same thing, but I find that the Siamese algae eater is notorious for doing that kind of thing. So you might want to think about letting your plants establish themselves a little bit before you maybe go from an Otocinclus to a Siamese algae eater. Now you can always rotate those kind of fish out of a tank. They are kind of hard to catch. The best thing I can tell you is to catch them in the evenings when they're sort of suctioned up against the walls of your tank and they're in kind of a sleep mode. It's a little bit easier to sneak in there with a net and get them out of her. It's actually less stressful on them because they can be real boogers to catch, and causes them a lot of stress and causes you a lot of stress too. Now, these fish are not the only answers for algae. One of the things that I would tell you that is the most important thing that I have found in any tank, regardless of the situation, is planting as many plants as you possibly can, and then of course water changes. Now, water changes are not something that's anyone's favorite task to do in keeping your tank healthy, but if you can really discipline yourself once your tank's established, doing 50% water changes a couple of times a week just after you've added fish to your tank is really going to go a long ways towards keeping algae down, and along with good plant growth in there. Most of the time I see little or none. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on this particular tank here is because I have a little issue that's popped up here on a tank that has been established for a very long time. If you look at the walls over in this area here and also on this side at a certain angle, you're seeing a little bit of spotty green algae that is not really showing up on the plants, but really showing up on the surface of the walls. Now, when I do water changes of 50% on these now once a month, I do a quarter every week on these tanks, but I also do on the fourth week of the month, I do a full 50%. I do scrub it down really good with a toothbrush and get that kind of stuff out of there. I typically don't see this in my tanks, and I really don't know what's going on with this one. There's obviously something that's creating an issue that this kind of algae is finding a footing to get itself going. So I do have a couple of Otocinclus in here, and they pretty much take care of the plant leaves and the rocks and that sort of thing. But I do believe that I'm going to be swapping them out over the next couple of days and putting some Siamese algae eaters in here, just because I think that they're going to be a little bit more effective at going around and taking care of the algae that I am not understanding or don't have a handle on why that algae is growing in there. There's really nothing that has changed in this tank to create that environment, the same lights. The only thing that I can think of is we used to have quite a bit more floating plants in here. I took most of those out. As you can see, there's one guy up in the corner here that I missed when I removed those. I've just not gotten around to taking that out of there, but there was a little bit more shade filtering through those floating plants, and that may have been the reason why that algae did not get established in the past. So we're going to drop some more floating plants in here, and between that and putting some Siamese algae eaters in here, I think that will take care of the problem. My experience is that it does. So the difference being that when you have a plant with Siamese algae eaters, you can really notice the difference in the tank just being absolutely clean as a whistle. I mean, they just do a fantastic job. Now there's a lot of people out there that are just not real fond of Siamese algae eaters. They think they're a little more aggressive. They think they're a little bit wild in their tank and that sort of thing. Well, they can be, but I think once they're well adjusted, Siamese algae eaters typically will be a fish that calms down and does not rip up your tank. They get used to sort of a routine just like any fish does, and I find that they do a fantastic job at just doing what they do best. So we're going to be adding those to this tank, and also adding some more floating plants in here, which I think is going to take the intensity of the light down. I don't really want to switch the light out. I really don't want to dim it, because all of the plants in here are sort of medium to low light requirements, and as you can see, everything's doing very well. So I don't really want to mess with that, other than putting some floating plants in here and creating some environments of filtered light coming in. Maybe that will, actually I shouldn't say maybe, likely that will take the algae issue down, along with adding the Siamese algae eaters. Now I will take the Otocinclus out of here, and I have plenty of places and plenty of tanks in my fish room or around my home where those can be used and live happily and do their job, and everybody's happy. So if you have any questions, please leave a comment. If you have any ideas that maybe I haven't hit on, or maybe you disagree with, please leave a message, and I will look at your comment, answer your comment, and go from there, because we all learn from each other. So if you've got something going on that you think is helpful, I'm absolutely open to listening to it. And you know, sometimes we connect the dots that way. That's the best way that all of us sort of learn how to be better at the hobby that we're in here. Anyways, hit subscribe, please. A lot of people are visiting, but they're not hitting the subscribe button. And we've got lots of great videos on here that are either tips or builds, or lots of things that we've run into that are great ideas on helping you to really enjoy the hobby a lot more by being less stressed and more in the way of enjoying your fish tanks more, because you have really kind of created an environment where you have less work for yourself. It's really comes down to the amount of work that you're willing to put into it and what you're not willing to put into it. So recapping, this one here, we're going to add some Siamese algae eaters in here, take the Otocinclus out, find a place for them. We're going to add some floating plants, and that's going to offer up a different light environment, which we, like I said, we had floating plants in here once before and did not have this issue. It's only been a month or so, and all of a sudden we're seeing this issue crop up. I'm going to go back to probably a little bit more aggressive water changes, probably back to 50% twice a week on a small 5-gallon tank like this. It's really not that hard to do. Anyways, hit subscribe, give us a thumbs up, and of course, leave any comments. We love to hear from you. And anyways, George with the Art of Water, and I appreciate the conversation with you today, and we'll talk again soon.